Welcome to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. This podcast is designed for the adult medical speech-language pathologist. Most of our audience members work in settings such as acute care hospitals, private practice, outpatient hospital clinics, and inpatient rehabilitation hospitals. Each episode has an accompanying course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Renee Garrett and I'm your Speech Therapy PD podcast host for Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for 0.1 ASHA CEU. Here are the financial and non-financial disclosures. Dr. Joanne Steel is employed at the University of Newcastle. She has no relevant non-financial relationships to disclose. And in-kind support Speech Therapy PD thanks Dr. Steel for her time and expertise. Dr. Elise Bogart is employed by the University of Sydney and her non-financial disclosure is that she's a committee member for the Australasian Society for the Study of Brain Impairment and leads TBI Bank resources, but obtains no financial benefit from these initiatives. We also would like to extend our thanks to Dr. Bogart for her time and expertise from Speech Therapy PD. My financial disclosure is that I'm the owner and founder of BrainBridge Connect, and as the host of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, and other webinars on Speech Therapy PD, I do receive financial compensation. I'm also an adjunct instructor at both James Madison University and Old Dominion University, and I am the secretary for the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia, which is my non-financial disclosure. And now, without further ado, we welcome our guest tonight, Joanne Steel, PhD, who is a lecturer at the University of Newcastle in Australia. She's a practicing speech pathologist with over 15 years of research and clinical experience with adults with traumatic brain injury or TBI. Her research focus has been on improving clinical methods for cognitive communication assessment and intervention after TBI. She's published more than 20 journal articles and 2 book chapters and is currently co-developing a story-based intervention program for cognitive communication disorders after TBI. Dr. Elise Bogart, PhD, is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney, Australia. Elise is a certified speech pathologist with over 10 years of clinical and research experience. She holds a PhD in acquired brain injury and has led the development of an internationally utilized educational resource and research database called TBI Bank. Elise is passionate about equipping clinicians with the knowledge and skills to implement evidence-based practice. Elise was the 2024 conference chair and an ongoing committee member for the Australasian Society for the Study of Brain Impairment. Thank you both for being with us tonight and welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Great, lovely welcome, and we're really excited to talk about our work today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to hear about it. So whoever wants to jump right in, I would really love to hear kind of what's the premise of the TBI Bank? I think a lot of people here in the States really aren't familiar with that. Well, I hope that changes. And I think that, we have such a great resource and the work that you all are doing. So if you could just kind of define what TBI Bank is, that would be great.
Yeah, I will take a bit of a lead in that. So TBI Bank is essentially an international database that contains language samples of people who have had a brain injury. It really came from my PhD work, and what we realized was that there really weren't any educational resources available, particularly to teach speech pathology students about what cognitive communication disorders look like. And we know that they're really often quite subtle. And so we wanted to put together like a package, an online resource and it's essentially free for people to use. They need to register, and it has modules where they can learn about cognitive communication disorder, a case-based format so people can really think about clinical application. And we've got a whole heap of videos from people who very kindly said that they would be happy for people to learn about brain injury. So that's, I guess, that in a nutshell. Yeah, that's TBI Bank. I think I'm not sure whether it would be helpful to maybe go back a little bit as well to talk about how Jo and I kind of came to be interested in working in brain injury
Yeah,
as
of
well.
course. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess I sort of worked as a clinician in a brain injury unit during the early part of my career. And I think I was always questioning, is what we're doing actually reflective of what people are needing for their everyday communication? I really had a lot of questions about, are people actually going to stop recovering after 6 months? Like, is that where recovery ends? And I really wanted to know, how do we assess and capture cognitive communication difficulties? And there just really wasn't a lot of resources available to do that. And Jo and I think, had this, similar experience of like not feeling like we had the resources available. And so, yeah, maybe I might flick over to you, Jo, to talk a little bit about your clinical experience, and then
Yeah.
maybe how we.
Sure. Yeah. So, as Elise said, around the same time as Elise was working clinically with people with TBI, I was doing the same thing. And I think we both started our PhD around the same time in different areas of Australia. So, it was around 2010. I was working in inpatient rehab, having a lot of the same kinds of feelings that Elise was having about my assessment practice. And I started a PhD actually looking at cognitive communication recovery for people who are in post-traumatic amnesia. So very early recovery, looking at how their communication recovered in the first sort of around 3 to 4 months of their recovery process. So I designed this, standardized battery with lots of different assessment measures in it, including some high-level language assessments and verbal fluency. And I also had some discourse tasks. So I was not a discourse fan at this point, and I don't know how many clinicians working in hospitals love using discourse, but I was not one of those people. So I had included discourse in my battery, but it wasn't my favorite thing to do at all. But by the end of my PhD, I actually realized that discourse measures were actually the best way to look at how communication was recovering for these people during the early stage of their recovery. So I kind of describe it as being dragged kicking and screaming to discourse. But I did come to see that it was really the most useful way of looking at communication for people with TBI. So I guess that was the point where Elise and I came together and started looking at how we could improve how clinicians use discourse clinically, because I feel like when I was at university, I didn't have a good experience of using discourse analysis. I don't know what it's like in the States, but during my undergrad, we really just did micro-linguistic measures. So it felt quite unpleasant to me. We had to do these transcriptions where we looked at, pause length and things like that, and transcribe it, which was very arduous, I guess, and not particularly practical to do in a hospital setting. So what I discovered throughout my PhD was that there were loads of other things you can actually do with discourse, one of them being not transcribe it, although I do recommend transcribing a sample, but lots of assessment and analysis methods you can use that are not particularly arduous, that don't take any longer to do in a clinical setting than, your other types of assessments that are not discourse based. So that's kind of how we both came to the space that we're in currently. A little bit of background.
The funny thing is, I did my thesis project had a discourse on, specifically it was a Cinderella story, and I remember being like, what? Why am I doing this? This is so boring, and also like you said, tedious, and like I knew that I was going to go into some sort of hospital-based setting at that point. I was fairly sure because, we don't know what kind of job we're going to get coming out of school. But I remember going like later on and going, what? Why would I, why would I do this? But I can, looking at things like the Cinderella story and the narrative retelling now, I see it differently, but I think it takes experience and time. Even if you don't do a PhD, I think just clinically in a hospital setting, whether it's inpatient rehab or acute care, which is kind of my background on both sides, in acute care wouldn't have been practical. Let's be honest. I mean, it wouldn't. Inpatient rehab, I could see it more, and definitely outpatient settings, I could see it really giving some benefit for understanding where the TBI patient is and maybe where we're going or where we could possibly go. So I appreciate you mentioning that because I think the relevance is probably a good direction to go in now and talk about the practicality of it.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you mentioned, Cinderella, Renee, it's something that always comes up every time we publish anything about it. I think similar to you, I was very reluctant to use the Cinderella narrative. I was like, we've got a population that's predominantly young males. Why are we doing a Cinderella narrative? But like you, I realized it was actually one of the few tasks actually that was sensitive to measuring and capturing the subtle problems that these people were having. And also subtle, it could capture their recovery as well. And so I think it's balancing that need of like getting the data that we need. But I think what's really exciting is that we are looking to develop some other assessments that are a little bit more practical and relevant for people now, which is exciting. So the original TBI Bank protocol was developed in, I think it was 2005, about 20 years ago. And since that time, we know so much has happened in the field. And so we've got an international working group together at the moment, and we're working on updating the protocol. We're looking to include some tasks that look at social cognition, some things like video retells that really harness some of the, the changes in the way that we communicate now compared to 20 years ago. So there are some changes coming along, which is really exciting. But I think also what we've got is a good starting point for people as well, because we know that the tasks we've got there in the protocol work now as well and can give us information that we need. The other thing I was thinking was, as Joe was talking about the transcription, it's also a really exciting time for us from a clinical perspective. I know our colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University have developed a tool now where they're about a few months away from releasing it, where you can put a transcript in, you can put a spoken language sample in, and it will develop a transcript for you that's coded as well for analysis. So it's kind of exciting that we're at this stage where we can use AI to do that. And they're also looking at ways we can do that securely as well, because we know that's an issue from a clinical perspective. So yeah, some really exciting stuff happening.
Yeah, so we have a question already, so that's good news. Is the protocol available online? And I was going to answer, but I'll let you all answer that because I already know the answer.
Yeah, so the protocol is freely available online and all of the resources are available too. So you can go and get the pictures. It gives you the prompts that you can use. So we'll pop the link to that in the show notes. To get through to the grand rounds component of the website, you do need to register. So there are parts of the website that you do need to register for access for, but it's all free and it's very easy to do. You just need to follow the instructions and you can access all of that. But the protocol is all easily available. So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
so if you've tuned into the other two episodes that we've done with the University of Sydney, the ABI Communication Lab is where you can also find the link to the TBI, I'll say TBI Bank Grand Rounds. Is that right?
Yeah, so there should be links from the ABI lab page through to the grand
Yes.
round.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've got a
Yeah.
whole heap of resources in there for people. And again, we're continuing to develop and add to that as we are sort of getting more input. Yeah. So I think that's where that one's at. But yeah, thank you for asking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think the range of resources is really important to talk about too, because again, one of the reasons that I reached out to you all and connected was just the fact that this is so embedded with evidence-based research. A lot of the things that you all are doing, or everything you're doing, really is based in evidence and research, and I think that's so important for those of us who are, like for me, I was taught how to discern research, and this is something that I've talked about a couple of times now, and a lot of people didn't maybe have that background and don't know how to really discern their own research when they're looking at studies, and they're not necessarily always looking at systematic reviews or meta-analysis of research, but they're looking at individual studies, and maybe they don't know how to discern that research. And so that's really, for me, was kind of the first stepping stone of why I reached out to begin with, because you all do such a great job with embedding the research, but also freely sharing what you're working on and what the evidence looks like, and supporting new treatment measures and outcomes for patients and that kind of thing. So, can you describe sort of what the range of the resources are related to the TBI bank right now?
Yeah, so in terms of the range of resources, there is sort of the three core components. There's the grand rounds component, which is that education module that I was mentioning at the beginning. There's the TBI Bank protocol, which is the assessment protocol. And then the third component of that is actually a research database. And that research database is something that we use to build the evidence that you're talking about, Renee. And Joe and I are also doing a bit of work at the moment in trying to set up a narrative-based project, and that's sort of our key focus at the moment. But you won't see a lot published about that because we're kind of right in the depths of looking at that. So yeah, it might be nice to maybe talk a little bit about why we're interested in doing that. Yeah. Do you, Joe, want to talk a little bit about your interest in narratives in particular? And then maybe we could
Yeah,
talk about the review that we did, a systematic
yeah,
review, Renee, because we know it's really hard to kind of figure out the evidence. And so we, even we were really immersed in it, but we still couldn't quite figure out what was available and out there for narrative-based treatment. So Jo kind of led that. So I might swap over to her to
yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah, perfect.
Sure. So I suppose we've had lots of questions about discourse over the last few years, and we've been doing quite a few different things, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about today. One of the things we did was looking at a systematic review of what interventions there were for narratives after a TBI. So we were particularly interested in narratives because they are used so much with assessment. So if we think about the kinds of assessments you do with someone with TBI, you typically do some kind of picture stimulus task, whether that's the cookie theft or the Cinderella story or a comic strip style sequence. So we really wanted to know what there was, what existed in terms of evidence for treating narratives for people with TBI. So what we did find that we did a big systematic review. I can't remember how many studies we started with, but we ended up with 6 studies in total that reported on treating narratives. So, and of those 6 studies, there were only really some gains in some areas for some participants. So it wasn't wildly effective for everyone doing treatments for narratives. But what we did source from those studies was really seeing that there were some key elements that were found to be particularly effective. So those key elements for treating narratives would be metacognitive and metalinguistic components. So metacognitive is getting the person with TBI to reflect on their own performance and predict, what they could do to improve their own performance. And metalinguistic really relates to going into a lot of detail, or a certain amount of detail, on what makes a good story. So what are the components of a good story, really explicitly, and then using scaffolding or supports that are gradually withdrawn throughout the therapy process. So we also found that there was potential for communication partner training with that and telehealth applications. So I guess take-home message really was that there's lots that could be done in this space that hasn't necessarily been reported on so far. So I guess we were quite shocked that there were so few studies out there. A lot of the evidence for intervention for cognitive communication after TBI tends to be communication partner training rather than working on the communication of the person with TBI. So I guess that stimulated us to really think about what we could be offering, what we could help develop as part of our kind of research evidence base in this space.
Yeah.
So we are, sorry, you go.
We definitely wanted the treatment stuff there. Like there's so much about assessment, but there's just such a little amount of evidence available for treatment. So yeah, and I think the other thing for me with the narrative stuff was that I could see how important it was for the person's identity and how they, storytelling has so much potential to support that recovery process, which is something I was really interested in. And then working with quite a few people, they told me that working through and practicing their story and telling the story of their brain injury was therapeutic in and of itself. And so that was really why I got interested in narratives, because I'm like, these are so powerful. Why aren't we treating and using this as a treatment format? Yeah, and so I think we did the review. We were pretty shocked about the lack of research in this area, so we took it upon ourselves and said we're gonna do a little bit in this space. I guess the other thing, just to kind of mention maybe before we jump into that, is we also had an honours student that we were working with a couple of years ago, and we were looking at the important event recounts. So that's a task within the TBI Bank protocol. And what I really like about that is it's a very functional, everyday task that people do is a recounts. Like we don't walk around telling a Cinderella narrative, but we do to recount the things that we're doing every day. So we've published that paper of hers and shown how we can look more at that macrostructural level and a way of coding and looking at how does the person organize and do they have all the components of a recount in there as well. So that's a really nice functional task. One of the things we really found was that people with a brain injury often didn't do well with that initial setup of the recount. So saying the who, what, where, when component. And also they didn't often provide an evaluation of the recount, which we found was something that was really missing in their recounts. So we kind of identified some potential targets there for people. So that was sort of a nice little project that we did with a very functional task that I think is relevant and kind of builds into what we're doing. I guess the other thing that we've been thinking about is the visuals and the nature of them. And Jo is the expert on visuals, because we have never liked all the visuals that really were out there when we started out. So Jo's really taken it upon herself to look at this. So I might hand over to her to talk a bit about the visual stimuli.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think as you were saying with the Cinderella task, I guess just speech pathology is my second career and my first career was in the arts. So I kind of came to this looking at the pictures that we were using and really not loving them at all. And I guess
Not the cookie theft? You don't love the cookie theft?
I do not love the cookie theft. I've spent so much of my time in the last few years examining the cookie theft picture. And yeah, so I guess when I think about design, I think, first of all, what something looks like has to be appealing to look at, or should be, but it also has to fit the purpose. It has to be designed and be fit for purpose. And a task like the cookie theft was designed for people with aphasia. It's part of an aphasia battery, as is the picnic scene from the WAB. But a lot of the tasks that we use with people with TBI are not designed for purpose. They are taken from various other places. So I don't know if you've used other tasks in your clinical work other than those ones that we've mentioned, but there are lots out there that are being used. And certainly we did a scoping review of what visual elicitation materials are used in research studies. And we found that the ones most used were kind of wordless children's picture books in research studies. So I just feel for adults with TBI, showing them a children's book or a Disney story is not necessarily appropriate, and potentially slightly, I don't know, it's certainly not going to be as engaging as something else that's designed for purpose. So we did the scoping review to find out what was in the evidence, and it was the children's picture books and the flower pot incident. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a 6-picture cartoon sequence from a foreign language learning resource. And a lot of the other materials came from the aphasia literature base or aphasia tests. So after that, we did a survey of Australian speech pathologists to find out what visual elicitation materials they used and what they thought of the ones that they used. And what we found was most clinicians here are using the cookie theft task with their clients with TBI, and most of them didn't like it. So we thought that was interesting. They had lots of reasons for using it, and we won't, obviously, lots of people use the cookie theft, and obviously it's useful, has a lot of evidence behind it. It has main concepts, it's quite easy to score, all of those reasons. And also people are familiar with it, so they like it for those reasons as well. But when asked what they would prefer to use, we found that most clinicians would really like to use videos with people with TBI, and they would like that to have a rating system so that they didn't have to kind of reinvent the wheel using a task. And they wanted images that were more age appropriate for their clients, so contextualized types of images as well. So we had lots and lots of input from clinicians on what materials they would like to use. And I think we have a paper that's coming out soon that's reporting on that research, which should be quite interesting for people to see. What else, Elise, can we say about the pictures?
I guess I'm just, reflecting on the fact that, something like the fact that we have the TBI Bank protocol, it has a range of different tasks. And so I think just pulling on what you were saying, Jo, is there is value in some of these tasks because they have that data available. So you can get really good data, but then you might want to balance that with something that's a bit more ecologically valid, like the important event recount. So, and I think, we are looking at some different and new ideas and ways to look at this. So yeah, I think it's kind of keep an eye on this, and we'll certainly be sharing those developments over the next period of time. I think one of the, we sort of mentioned before about the narrative interventions. So it might be good just to kind of jump back into that now that we've segued a little bit, where, we were really interested in developing a narrative-based treatment, but we particularly felt like there was this gap in the inpatient setting. Like I remember as a speech pathologist, I was like, okay, there's all this communication partner training, which is fabulous, but the family members are at work all day. What am I doing with this person in front of me? And they're saying they're bored. And so I felt like I just didn't have anything to work on in inpatient rehab with people. So I was particularly interested in developing something that would work in that setting. But we also know that it's really hard to work in those settings as well. So we thought, well, we don't want to come up with a beautiful treatment manual and say, here, implement this treatment, narrative treatment. We wanted to do that collaboratively with people. So we got a group of people with lived experience of brain injury. We've got a group of clinicians, and we've also got a group of researchers who are helping us to develop this narrative-based treatment. What we have done so far are a few rounds of focus groups with each of those different groups. And I think it's so much better than what we could have developed on our own. And working with the clinicians and the people, I think it's got a much better chance of implementation, because I think that's a lot of the issue with research, is that we come up with these fabulous ideas, but we haven't thought about, is that actually going to work in practice? And so some of the key things that are really coming out, and which we suspected from our clinical background as well, is that clinicians really need much more flexible resources. So just having a manual and saying, here, run through these 12 modules is not going to work for everyone. So we're trying to develop a more flexible treatment program here. So building that flexibility into the program, building the flexibility to work on a range of different targets. So we know people with brain injury can have such a range of difficulties. Some people have the word finding problems. Some people, it's a lot of it is the awareness and insight issue. But how do we account for that variability? So it's very tricky, but I feel like we're coming up with something that is really going to work. So at the moment, what we've got is like a drafted and accessible patient resource booklet that we've started to develop for the program. We've got like a prototype clinician manual that has inbuilt flexibility within it. And we've also made sure that we've mapped out the theoretical foundations for the program as well. So we do want to make sure that we're building in a strong theoretical foundation, making sure we've got behavioral theory, for example, embedded in it, so that it's also got that strength. And so we have found it challenging pulling those three areas together. But yeah, we're really excited in being able to kind of develop this program. So we're still in the process of developing it. But I'm hoping that because we have done this co-design process, that it is going to be well suited to that inpatient setting and well received by people. So I think that's a kind of stay tuned. Jo, was there anything else to mention about that one?
Just, I guess it was quite interesting when we were talking to people with lived experience of TBI, how much they felt they needed an education component more than they received in the inpatient setting. And I suppose we've all had that experience where we feel like, well, we've already kind of talked about that with the patient, and they're saying they haven't had that information. It's just really important to kind of keep giving that information in a fairly structured and take-home way. So we're sort of looking at creating some kind of resource that the patient can take with them from setting to setting. Because I think that was one of the other issues that we found, is that sometimes patients pass through the inpatient setting and then go to another setting or are discharged home, and they often sort of lose touch with intervention, or the next clinician who takes on their treatment doesn't know where they're up to, or finds it difficult to kind of keep the momentum going on what they've been working on. So we wanted to create a resource that would be useful to the person with brain injury, for them to kind of carry with them, I guess, and reflect back on as they go through their recovery process. And just one more thing I wanted to mention on that is that we do have a PhD student working on this, Rhianne Hoffman, who's currently doing her PhD on this topic. And she is at the moment creating a survey that hopefully will be released soon, asking clinicians what kinds of cognitive communication intervention they do in the hospital setting. So I feel like this is something that we really don't know much about. And I know from our own experiences, it was very much ad hoc what you do with a patient in inpatient rehab, despite that being the setting where, your patient has most access to therapy. I don't know what it's like in the US, but here we have our patients typically get daily therapy for,
Yeah.
you know, even in some cases, access to up to 2 hours a day in some situations. And certainly patients with aphasia get a lot of inpatient rehab. So we really wanted to find out specifically what happens in hospital settings for patients with TBI, because as we found, there's doesn't seem to be a lot of research evidence out there for clinicians to access to find out what to do in that setting.
Well, I think the funny thing for me is listening to you talk about, and I know this too, the communication partner training research is so strong, but I feel like in the US, we don't always do a lot of that because I get a lot of feedback now when I'm teaching courses, and it's like, can you talk about communication partner training? Can you talk about support for caregivers? Because that's something that I took on because I was a caregiver before I was a clinician. And so it's important to me to continue on with knowing what I didn't get as a family member and caregiver, and, you know, kind of feeling like other people had to have had the same experience. But a lot of times what we're seeing here is that sometimes patients in the acute care setting moving into inpatient rehab have never heard the word aphasia, have never heard the word cognitive communication or dysarthria or whatever the speech diagnosis is. They've never heard that word, or maybe they heard it and it was so early on in their acute phase of their illness that they don't recall. They never got visual supports, they never got educational written supports or follow up with that. And so I'm listening to what you all are saying about the communication partner training piece, but also knowing that working in inpatient rehab as my first job, that everything that I try to do was stay away from workbook based stuff, right? I tried to do functional, like if you want to make a cake because you're a grandma who wants to cook for your grandkids, or you want to go home and go back to work and you need to do these functional tasks where you have to send emails or receive emails and be able to decipher what those things are. But a lot of clinicians at that point, because again, I'm like you, this was like 2010, 2011, 2012, they weren't doing that. They weren't used to doing that, and they weren't, maybe they were kind of in that status quo of doing the same thing they'd always done, and didn't really look at that. And so now fast forward 15 years and we're looking at shared decision making and having the patients involved in their own goal setting and looking at the functional treatment that we could be doing that. And I'm saying all that to say, circling back to narratives, I can see how all of that interplays, because the narrative is when we're talking about people as families or people in relationships or people in friendships or work settings where they're having these conversations about not only their day to day of what happened to them personally, but like their day to day from a work standpoint, their day to day as a human being, right? They saw this story on the news that maybe impacted their day, or uh, they had this experience at their church or their community group or whatever that impacted their day, and they need to be able to retell that. And I think that's one of the things that gets lost on a lot of people is they're not, one, they're not always looking at the research that supports it, but two, they get stuck, right? Get stuck in these ruts of how we're treating patients, and we have all these other demands of going to meetings and meeting productivity, and we have 2 weeks with this patient, or maybe we have 4 days with this patient to make an impact, and we don't know that maybe they're going home and their home is 50 miles away from where we're at, and we'll never see them again. So there's a lot of things I think that really interplay with everything that you're saying, and it's just there's so many things that trickle down and impact what we do and how we do it. Just sorry, I'm looking in the chat. Someone said clinicians may have been reluctant to work on conversational skills because it's more complicated to get objective data for documentation. Yeah, and I think that's true too. What do you all think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the funding can certainly be an important factor that comes in here as well, which we haven't touched on yet, but happy to sort of talk a little bit about that. And getting that objective data, yeah, can be really tricky. I think, where we've been heading with the things like the Cinderella narrative, something like that, you can get quite objective data. And that was something that was really important to me as a clinician, was I just want some objective data rather than me just saying this person is, going off topic. I want something to be able to measure that and to show that the person is changing. And so one of the things that I was interested in was actually trying to develop some stratification of like severity when I did some earlier research into that. So I actually looked at how do we classify like a mild difficulty or a moderate discourse difficulty to then potentially show that somebody has recovered and changed. So I think that's where those type of tasks are really good, the monologic tasks in particular. I think conversation is really complicated because you've got the impact of the communication partner that can influence the person's performance. So it can often be difficult to get a really good baseline of that person. So my advice to my students is always get a conversation sample, but also do the monologic. Like I think you need to do both of them. It goes hand in hand. So yeah, I'm not sure if Joe, if you had anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I agree, Elise. I think having objective measures as much as you can, I think the narrative task is quite a useful one just because you can constrain a lot of the variables. So you don't have the impact of the communication partner. It's a fairly, predictable length of sample that you'll get, and you can measure it with these kind of tangible measurements. But just going back, Renee, to what you were saying about working in the hospital setting and you're wanting to focus on something functional like making a cake or talking about what the person did at the weekend or what they did at work or whatever, those topics that people typically want to talk about and want to do, that's something that we really wanted to work into our therapy. I feel that experienced clinicians find it quite easy to do that kind of free form functional assessment and treatment. But certainly novice clinicians or clinicians who don't have a huge amount of experience with TBI really struggle. And that's why they're using workbooks with those very decontextualized types of activities. So that was something that we really wanted to work into the therapy that we're developing, is how to provide supports for clinicians to do functional, contextualized types of tasks like the ones you were talking about. So we want to, help the clinician to rate, the person telling a story about what they did on weekend leave, for example, or stories that people tell, and we label them narratives, but they are just, anecdotes that people tell, or just, parts of conversation even. A conversation is typically, two people, doing their kind of monologic contributions to that interaction with co-construction and a whole pile of other things going on as well. So yeah, definitely very interesting. And yeah, human communication obviously is so hard to measure and so hard to treat because we have all those other factors like what was the person like before the brain injury? Are we trying to cure something that wasn't a problem for them before they had their injury? Were they normally tangential? Were they normally, I'm sure we all know people whose social communication is, extreme in one direction or another. And as Elise said, I always give examples to my students of, the typical teenage boy who just has yes, no responses to anything. Would that be something we would want to treat after a brain injury if that's what he was like before the brain injury? So it's a really complex area, but I feel like at the moment there are just so few resources for clinicians without a huge amount of experience.
No,
I think
Oh, I was gonna say I agree 100% because we get the confabulators who
mm,
a lot of people don't understand and they get upset by that. And I always describe it as like a word stew of someone's just come in and they've thrown all these memories that people have who have a TBI into this one pot. And they're trying really hard. It's not like they're doing it on purpose. They're trying really hard to tell you something from their past, but everything's been thrown into this big giant stew pot and they can't really identify details from this story or this narrative or this conversation. It all comes out into one big story that sounds like a big bunch of lies, but
yeah.
it's not for them. It's like how they kind of start being able to have conversations again.
It's interesting you bring up the confabulation. A colleague of ours, Nicole Cruz, who's in, just trying to remember her,
Connecticut.
Connecticut, thank you.
Connecticut.
She, I guess started this conversation with us about, confabulation. And so, it's something that we are looking into at the moment because, again, it's an area that really has very little research in terms of what is it and what do we do about it. But I think, the form of it is that narrative, and these people have that really instilled belief that what they're saying is true. And so that's a really difficult thing to kind of manage. The other thing that you mentioned just a bit before was just about aphasia. And I just wanted to quickly mention a little bit about aphasia in the context of TBI, because this is a population within, we often think about aphasia and cognitive communication disorder as two very distinct things. But my experience is that we actually have a group of people who have the cognitive communication disorder and unfortunately also have the aphasia. And I'm just thinking of, an example of a patient I worked with who had a snowboarding accident, hit his head, and, had that aphasia, which was really prominent. But what I found was that actually, the stroke kind of stuff is very much based on a completely different population. So working with aphasia in the TBI population, you also need to think about all those other cognitive communication difficulties on top of your aphasia treatment. And so that's a population that I'm quite interested in. I've done some research and we found about 16% of people in our cohort had the aphasia. But even how do we distinguish that was quite an interesting question. How do you distinguish the frank aphasia versus word finding just from the general cognitive impairment as well? So that's been a question I've been trying to unravel a little bit. And really some of the features of the frank aphasia that we saw were the presence of like phonemic paraphasia, perseveration, which we didn't see quite as much in the cog communication sample, but also their semantic paraphasias they were quite different in terms of the nature. So they were quite close rather than distant. Sorry, they had quite distant semantic paraphasias in our aphasia sample. So there are distinct characteristics that we can see, and actually Discourse has been a way to help us to really unpack that. I'm currently working with a student at the moment to put together some resources to help people who have aphasia to kind of talk about their recovery and put that cognitive and language support available as well. So I think they're an interesting population that often are missed as well. So I just wanted to mention that too.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, and I think when we're looking at things like the COGCOM population, we tend to look at things like attention and memory and executive function. But when we're looking at the brain holistically and how all that interplays, and I'm saying this because it's what I just finished teaching a language disorders in adults graduate class here. We were wrapping up today and trying to get the students to understand that all of this you can't look at just because this person had a TBI in the right temporal parietal lobe. They may have other things that are impacted because the brain interplays and is interconnected. And so you may see these components that impact language in a way that maybe you weren't expecting. And I think we're kind of moving in, I'm sure you all as working in the universities too, we're moving away somewhat from only teaching theory and this kind of overall general neuroanatomy, which they need to know that too. Don't get me wrong, but them students being able to think of it integratively in how that all connects, because we may see this impact in an area where maybe you weren't expecting it, but maybe they had a pre-existing mental health condition like an anxiety disorder, ADHD, or a history of bipolar depression, whatever it is. We have to be looking at all those components, and I think that part is somewhat of a challenge for people who, like you mentioned, maybe aren't as seasoned, but also aren't as looking at the brain holistically or looking at the body holistically and just trying to separate this little piece from this little piece to this. And it is a challenge, I think, for a lot of people and a lot of clinicians to look at it because they're relying on their training and maybe not always finding it easy to integrate research and all the other things that they're doing and integrate this newer research or these ways that we could have and should have probably been doing things all along.
I love that you bring that up, Renee. I know Louise Keegan and Jerry Hepner are really interested in kind of looking at how all these factors come into play and really trying to think about, they're looking at the framework and theoretical framework, but then they're trying to go, how does this map onto our assessment and how does this map onto treatment, to try and make that explicit link for clinicians to kind of help translate that to clinical practice. So I know they've already published one paper on that, and then we're looking to do a second update of that as well. So yeah, that's some really nice work that really takes that integration. And just to kind of reiterate the TBI Bank grand rounds, we kind of are trying to take that approach of like the case-based approach. But yeah, it's tricky because I think you want to also help people see patterns in like what is this typical pattern we see, but then we still need to treat everyone as an individual person who has all these unique factors that come into play. So yeah, that's part of our clinical expertise, isn't it? Kind of, yeah, thinking about how we do that. I guess one other thing to mention was a little bit about something that changed my thinking quite a bit is when you were talking about how do we address real life communication, I was thinking about, how do we capture that? And I remember when we did a project called Communication for Safe Care, we followed the patient's journey through the healthcare service. That was really interesting for me to think about all the communication that happens along the patient's journey. So like even from their initial, if somebody's coming from the community, it might be, they have communication from the initial referral information that they need to be able to read. And then maybe they need to organize themselves to get to the appointment. They need to be able to follow the wayfinding signage, that's available. They need to then interact with a receptionist. And it just has really transformed how I think about communication. That functional communication is what is the patient's journey, and following their journey is really interesting. And then yeah, so that I guess stems from a project called Communication for Safe Care. We partnered with some New South Wales health care sites. And this was broader than just brain injury. This was looking at communication access more broadly. And yeah, it's just been a really interesting way of thinking about communication from that environmental and service perspective as well. And how can we in our healthcare services enhance the environment and the interactions more broadly beyond just our clinical interaction with them. So that's been a really interesting project as well.
Yeah, and I was thinking about too, just something we touched on way back when I initially met with you all before the holiday, like way back. Oh gosh, November, I think it was looking at access to care, because I know, and I can't remember if we talked about this before, but I know when I first started in inpatient rehab was my first job, our typical length of stay for a TBI patient, and of course, it's always insurance dependent here in the States, but it was typically anywhere from the average was 3 to 5 weeks. And by the time I left after 7 years, it was 10 to 14 days, which is, roughly 10 days to 2 weeks. And so, I don't know how much your access to care is impacted by your health insurance. Is it impacted more by physician referral? Is it, I think it's just an interesting discussion to have, because I just don't know the answer. And I know here it's gotten really, really awful. Because then when I left outpatient, I was getting referrals for TBI patients, and I got 4 visits sometimes. And I will say it. I said it before, and my students laugh when I say it, but I'm good, but I'm not that good. Like 4 visits, really.
I think that's unfortunately true everywhere now. I know my experience a few years ago, we were seeing patients who are an inpatient for up to 6 weeks. And now, as you say, it's gone down to being counted in days more. We have guidelines here that recommend that patients aren't discharged until they've emerged from post-traumatic amnesia. So for
Okay.
some people, that does kind of protect them a little bit from being discharged earlier. But yeah, I guess to a large extent, it does depend on what kind of insurance the patient is covered under. And I don't know if Elise, you wanted to talk through some of the models that we have here.
Yeah, I mean, we have a few major funding bodies here. So our Medicare system is our public health system, and that really covers that acute and inpatient rehabilitation. But thereafter, on discharge, they're either funded by our iCare program. This is a statewide funding body, so it does vary according to state here. But essentially, that's covered by vehicle insurances. And so people have fairly good support provided by iCare. One of the main issues we've had is not clinicians having to more strongly advocate for patients. And so that's where they've called us in and they've said, you know, we're really struggling to get the funding for our patients at the moment. And so some of the things that we've been doing with our local clinicians is putting together evidence briefs and education for those funding bodies, because they just, as they've had changeover in staff as well. So like they might have had people in there originally who had a really good understanding of the needs of this population. And over time, perhaps that's changed a bit. And so the advocacy is really important, but we know it takes a huge amount of time from clinicians as well. So we're trying to figure out how we can help and support, advocate at that system level too. The other major system we have for non-vehicle related injuries is our National Disability Insurance Scheme. And so this was really a big game changer. So it came in, would be about 5 years ago now, Jo, is that right?
Yeah.
And so it basically now provides that support for people, but it is getting harder and harder again to advocate that people have those needs. So unless they have very severe physical injury, which we know the cognitive stuff is so much harder, it's that invisible disability. It can be really hard to advocate for. So I think we try to get creative about how we advocate, and often we talk about safety for people. So we often say, you know, if a person can't read their medication label, you know, that's a big safety issue. So really trying to tie it back to, you know, really functional implications from a safety perspective, we find really speaks to people. So yeah, I think that's something that we try to do. Yeah, I think that's probably the key.
Yeah.
I mean, we are very lucky here in Australia that we do have, you know, a nationwide safety net. Just, I do think people slip through the gaps sometimes. For example, our insurance for people who have an accident on the road, often those people get much better services than people who potentially have had an accident on the driveway before they pull out onto a public road. So I remember having long conversations about, you know, how many meters from a public road the person was when the injury happened, and that would be worth tens of millions of dollars of ongoing care. I guess now a lot of those people are picked up by the National Disability Insurance Scheme, but we still again see, you know, for people who are not of working age, they may not get the services that people who are of working age do. So it's complex, as I'm sure it is everywhere, but we are relatively very lucky here in Australia, having a bit of a safety net, I guess.
Wow. Well, that's incredible. But, you know, and just in wrapping up, we don't have any other questions. And I just really appreciate you both, Dr. Bogart and Dr. Steele, Joe and Elise, for coming on and agreeing to share your information and knowledge. And I'm so excited about the research you're doing and excited to see these next couple of papers that are coming out. And we will post some show notes so that you have, you know, listeners, you have access to the research and you can follow up with that and see where this is going. And again, I just appreciate you both for being so willing to share your time, your expertise, and talk about non-popular narrative discourse, which I think you've changed people's minds because I think this was very helpful for me too as a clinician. And I just really appreciate you both being on here.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you
us
so
here. It's
much.
great. And yeah, we're always happy for people to reach out if they need help too. Yeah.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Thanks again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. We appreciate your positive reviews and support and would love you to write a quick review. Also, subscribe. If there's a topic you'd like to see us cover in the future, you can email us or comment in the comments section or message us on social media. Remember to go to Speech Therapy PD to learn more about earning ASHA CEOs for this episode and more.